This is the Wait Just an Infosec podcast, your weekly opportunity to tap into the minds of some of the world's foremost cybersecurity experts. Wait Just an Infosec is a weekly show live streamed on SANS Institute social media channels on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The show features a wide range of guests from across the InfoSec community. Whether we're diving into the weeds of the latest data breach or exploring the security implications of groundbreaking technology such as generative AI, each episode brings you new insight to keep you engaged in the industry, feed your fire for knowledge, and amplify your value as an InfoSec practitioner. Join the SANS community and gain free access to cutting-edge industry news, cybersecurity resources like technical research, and tools that can't be found elsewhere. Subscribe for free today at sans.org/join.
Operational technology security has never been more important. When beginning the work of securing your industrial control system environment, there are 5 key controls that you should consider. In this episode of Wait Just an Infosec, ICS security pioneer and expert Robert M. Lee takes the chair as host, exploring which key controls to focus on in your OT environment, but through the lens of digital forensics and incident response.
Let's go. Hopefully that was informative to folks, but we're going to get on to the main portion of the presentation today, which is going to be a conversation with you all about the 5 critical controls. So I'm going to outline them and go through kind of what we were trying to do and how to use them. And then hopefully we'll get a bunch of questions. So go ahead and start racking in your questions, especially if you've already read the paper or just have general questions about ICS security too, for all that matters. Feel free to go ahead and start asking and we can start lining those up. But 5 critical controls. So how did this come about? Why did we do it? There's a lot of standards and things out in the community already. What was our intent? Cool. So Tim and I, for years, have been at SANS. I've been there about a decade now. So I'm a fellow in the ICS curriculum, wrote the ICS 515 kind of network monitoring and incident response for industrial control system class. And then I wrote the Forensics 578 cyber threat intelligence class in the DFIR curriculum. But anyways, from the industrial control system side of the house, there's constant questions we would get from students over the years. And I would see these same questions out in my day job at Dragos and seeing these same kind of conversations happen with clients and so forth. And at the core of it, it really came down to we haven't necessarily done a lot in OT before, most companies. We've either done the regulatory side if we are regulated, or we've done like maybe a segmentation project or put in the firewalls and kind of maybe put in some switching and things like that. But we haven't really done all of the investment that we think we should be doing relative now to the fact that the environments have changed and become largely more digital, more connected, and we're seeing adversaries targeting and disrupting these environments. Where do we get started? What do we do? And a lot of the standards and frameworks are really, really good, right? NERC CIP on the regulation side for bulk electric systems in the US, 62443 for a kind of a global standard that's used pretty heavily too in manufacturing and oil and gas, NIST cybersecurity frameworks. Like these things exist, but they can be daunting when you look at them. And some people, in my opinion, use them inappropriately, where instead of saying, what should we do? And let's map it to the framework to have a common language, a lexicon, they instead treat it like a bingo card. Well, I got to do this. 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 And then there's no real strategy behind it. It's just kind of going down a checklist of like controls that you may be able to do. And it may not be the biggest risk reduction to your environment. And more importantly, depending on your environments, like you could be gold plating the problem, spending way too much money, because not all assets are created the same. It's not like there's one IT network. It's a bunch of OT networks. And so that OT or operations technology side of the house, you might have 1,000 plants. You might have, 1,000 substations. Heck, even if you have 5, what are the priorities? Anyways, so taking this backdrop of people wanted to know where to get started and wanted to understand what are the critical controls. And we got asked for years about the critical controls because SANS developed years ago the top 20 critical controls, and that was for IT, right? So that those 20 critical controls were pretty popular in the community, pretty widely used. And so all the time we get hit up with, cool, what are the critical controls for ICS? And so Tim and I started this years ago and sat down originally with trying to map the 20 critical controls over, and it just didn't work. Also, a lot of the 20 critical controls are preventative focused. It's not really getting a lot into detection, response, recovery, which are very, very core for everybody, but especially in industrial operations. The ability to get like root cause analysis when something goes wrong, whether it's adversarially related or not, is core to being able to actually operate your facilities. So what Tim and I did is we sat down and said, cool, let's take all of the incidents that we're aware of, public and non-public, like all the threats, all the attacks that have taken place on industrial control systems. And let's apply a very basic filter of what are the controls that were effective in all of these attacks. Like what were security controls that would have been good investments for everything? And I wanted to keep us out of, well, this could have been useful in this way, or this could have been useful, because eventually you're going to get 30, 40, 50 items. I was like, no, let's not go down the path of what could have been. What was really useful? Like what's the top control that would have been useful in that incident? Okay, what are the top couple? Like what are consistently good investments? That way it's not, hey, this is a good security control against this edge case threat. That might not be a good investment for your company. It wouldn't be a critical control. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but it might not be the best investment. But if it's one of, this is consistently useful in all the different incidents, well, not only is that a good control, that's something you really should be doing. That is something that's, again, consistently good. So that's the filter we applied. What is consistently useful in all of these attacks, and what would have been good controls to have in all of these attacks. And that sort of formed these 5 controls. Originally, I just wanted 4, kind of the Australian ASD did like their 4 years ago. And I like just keeping it simple, like 3 or 4 is good. We made it into 5, but it's a heck of a lot better than like the 20 and everything else that can follow. And so I was really excited that we got it down to the 5 that made sense. And one of the major insights I've had dealing with incident response cases and similar, and just being a part of a lot of these major attacks, from everything from Colonial Pipeline to Ukraine to whatever else, was the necessity of it being a strategy. So we need it to be together. It can't just be checklist box, going down the line. That's how we get problems with compliance. It's got to come together to be a strategy. And I wanted it to be focused on threats. And to do that, I wanted to start with incident response. And so that's the first critical control, is ICS specific incident response. Now, there's a lot to go into this, so I'll explain. But why was that so important in the beginning? In my observation with the incidents I've worked, almost always there is a disconnect between the executive staff and board and the practitioners on what the ground truth reality is with what can be done in the incident, or how prepared you were for it in the first place. Additionally, in IT security, there's a lot of native logging and native data for a systems and data world. Okay, so IT is very systems and data. If Microsoft rolls out a vulnerability on accident that allows remote code execution and privilege escalation on a new, fully patched Windows box, that's a bad day for everybody, and everybody's feeling it. So that system focus means that there's a lot of security controls focused on that system, endpoint protection system. You're looking at patch management in a very, very serious way, because it's to focus on the system. You are taking a lot of access controls and similar on that system, password changes and so forth on that system. And also data, systems and data. I'm generalizing a lot, but generally speaking, IT security, system and data. And on the data side, PII, credit cards, things of importance. You're going to have encryption at rest, encryption in transit, data loss, prevention technologies and tools, monitoring for that data, classification markers, etc. Systems and data. In OT, it's systems of systems and physics. I don't really care what happens to an engineering workstation. Adversary jumps onto an engineering workstation. It's not a great day, but if they jump on and exploit it and there's a vulnerability on it, whatever, okay, not necessarily bad. But an adversary getting on an engineering workstation with or without vulnerabilities and malware, but with the knowledge of how to use System 1, the engineering workstation, to reprogram a logic controller and runtime operations, System 2, in such a way that there's a physical manifestation in that plant, System 3, that's dangerous. Systems of systems and physics. So, taking it back to the incident response piece, you absolutely should prepare for incident response anyways. but you can get through IT incident response cases without really preparing. And I know that sounds horrible, but you can't. There's enough data, there's enough tooling out there, et cetera, that let's say you have an incident in your IT environment, you didn't do much. You're going to call in a Unit 42, a Mandiant, a CrowdStrike, whatever, and they're going to come in and they're going to drop their tools on those systems, and it's going to be able to pull the data that's resident on that system. And of course, you would have wanted more, but you're going to be able to fumble through the investigation. Okay, you're going to be able to get through it because all that system and all that data kind of focus has surfaced up a lot of data to be pulled even after the attack. In a systems of systems world and in a physics world, if you didn't collect the data before the attack and during the attack, it may not be present. In most cases, it won't be. If the adversary on the engineer workstation is sending network commands, let's say it's a Yokogawa system and they're sending VNet IP protocol commands to a Yokogawa controller to modify the logic, unless I've got backups already of that logic to do a diff between them, or unless I'm doing like network monitoring and understand the protocols to see what commands were sent, there's not a whole lot I can answer from that incident. It's transient data between a systems of systems that if it wasn't collected, there's nothing to collect after the fact. There'll be some logs, but not much. Not as much as you'd have in a systems world and a data world. So a lot of the ICS incident response cases I've taken, the big finding beyond the disconnect between board and executives and practitioners, the big finding is the questions that were going to need to be answered during and after the incident for regulatory, legal, for operations, for security, for business choices, all that are very rarely not obtainable. They're not answerable because people weren't collecting the right data before the incident. So let's say there's 20-ish questions that people want to ask during an incident response. If they're not prepared ahead of time, they're answering like 2 or 3 of them. And so a lot of ICS incident response turns into therapy and then a post-compromise hunt because you're really not doing the incident response because you don't have any of the data and there wasn't the tooling deployed ahead of time. And I can't just come in and drop things into those environments or drop a tech stack in as easily. So there's a lot of things that just cause it to be overly complex without preparation. So that first critical control, the ICS incident response, really sets the strategy for what are we doing. You're essentially reverse engineering out the incident. So you start off with what are our crown jewels? What are our plants and facilities and so forth that matter the most? Got it. And so you have that list. Maybe it's the top 25, 50% of your facilities. With that, what are the scenarios that we should be good with as a company? Now, I'm not talking about just like making up scenarios. One of the big disconnects between security practitioners and board members is a lot of security practitioners want to throw out, oh, I saw this research at DEF CON and you could take a Bluetooth on a wind turbine and spin it back. And the first question is, has it ever happened? And I go, no, but I'm not interested. And the security side of the house sometimes feels we're not being proactive. Actually, though, the role of the board, especially in invested companies and public companies and similar, it's very much around benchmarking. So what are we doing against peers? And it's about scenario planning. And you're not generally going to get scenario planning and benchmarking buy-in from a board on things that have never happened. So that's the first step. So that's setting the strategy essentially through having what are the scenarios that matter. And you should be industry specific. As an example, if I'm an electric power company, it is really important for me to understand ransomware and operations. It's important for me to understand Ukraine 2015 scenario, Ukraine 2016 scenario, and pipe dream. Those are 4 things that have happened in the electric industry that matter. Oil and gas, ransomware and operations, Trisis scenario, pipe dream. So you're going to find like 3 to 4 scenarios to get started with of things that have actually happened in your industry. And those are setting the groundwork of this is the thing that matters. This is the scenario. That scenario then is what we have to think about. Well, if that happened to us, what data would we need? How would we detect it? What would be taking place, et cetera, to be able to get the data that we need for the incident, to be able to detect the threats, to be able to do all these things. It's hyper important to use those scenarios to guide the conversation. Otherwise, you're going to get in debates on the team. Was this a good control or a bad control? That's an ethics discussion. None of the controls are good or morally bad. What they are is they're controls on, are they relevant to reduce the risk that we've all agreed on. First thing, incident response, set the scenarios. That's going to help you actually understand what you need. It's going to lay the strategy for all the rest of it. And the benefit is it's now easy to communicate. Whether you're talking to your operations staff, your security staff, your board, anybody, it makes cybersecurity tangible now, because it's not simply something like, I want to make sure that I have a risk score or a FICO score or whatever. And it's like, what's the difference between 73 and 78? Like, cybersecurity tends to be really intangible because of the way we talk about it. But if I say to operations or a board or anybody else, here's a scenario that if actually happened, do we all agree that this is a real risk? Yes. Cool. Do we want to mitigate these risks? Yes. Cool. Well, based on how this attack actually took place across the full kill chain view, if you will, here is how we can do prevention, detection, response, and recovery. And as a result, this is the package that we're going to need to go deploy at these companies and so forth. And yeah, in case you're wondering, it's live. Yeah, obviously it's very live. But anyways, I love the comments on the side here. But essentially, what we get out of that is a way to communicate what we're doing in a way that everybody can understand, and it's tangible. Hey, if this scenario happens in our company, we're not saying we're perfect or good at everything, but we're saying we have the protections in place that we need and are considered best in class for the scenarios we actually are concerned with. And board and ops folks and similar, we're going to come back to you. Security is never finished. When there's new scenarios that are in our industry, we'll have a conversation if we accept the risk or not. And you'll find out that most of the security controls we put in place have value on other scenarios we haven't even identified yet. So you're showing yourself to be a good business leader. You're showing yourself to be able to be responsible with investments. You're able to show being able to mitigate risk that we don't even know about yet, or at least the starting of it. But you're also opening the door to, we will come back. And if we have other security controls in the future, it'll be based on us talking about this scenario and getting alignment on it. So now it's not us versus them or intangible or, the cybersecurity folks. Now it's a real conversation and done really well. All right. So ICS incident response. The second critical control is defensible architecture. And what is a defensible architecture? Well, the first thing is it has certain characteristics. One thing about a defensible architecture is I can put humans into the environment to defend it. There's no such thing as a secure product or secure architecture or secure whatever. It's defensible or indefensible. If it's defensible, I can put human defenders to go against the human adversaries in that environment. Maybe it's something as simple as having a span port on a switch that I can be able to access and do data, but defensible. So I need to define what is a defensible architecture to me. Instead of just doing, taking 62443 or zones and conduits, whatever, I can instead look and say, what is the scenario? What would we need the architecture to support? What's the data collection or the collection management framework? Another paper I wrote, like what's the collection strategy of the data we need for the detection and response? What are some of the risks we can eliminate or reduce just by the architecture? If ransomware is one of our big scenarios in operations, a lot of the ransomware cases happen in OT from when an IT domain controller gets compromised and it pushes into the operations side of the house. A lot of times the OT, there are some targeted ones, but a lot of times the OT incident response cases we take, we're not targeted OT. It just spread through that combined and conjoined architecture, especially on things like domain controllers. So I might say, well, I want to separate out the domain controller. I want to have a unique domain controller for the operations side of the house because of this risk that we've identified in the scenario and all agreed on. That's going to be an aspect of our defensible architecture. So defensible architecture can mean a lot of things. And there's no like, this is the cookie cutter, place to go apply it. It's, does this actually align to our scenarios? Is it make it where humans can defend in that environment while we mitigate some of the other risks? Then this is a good architecture. And again, it's not getting into the bingo game. And it's also not getting into the place where we're just throwing out all the possible security controls. And I want to do this. I want to do this. I want to do this. Well, this is a risk and this is a risk. Well, how do we get through with man-in-the-middle attacks? And it's like, guys, stop. You're just going to end up pissing off all your operations staff. You're going to end up over spending against the risk. And everybody's going to have no idea what's going on. There's no alignment. It's going to cause friction. So by saying these are the characteristics that we need against the scenarios we have, that is why we're doing it. It aligns the conversation. It removes a lot of the debate, the friction, and the drama. So incident response, ICS incident response, where you're picking out your scenarios, you're actually thinking about what you need out of it, you're figuring out what you need out of the collection and so forth. moves into security control 2, your defensible architecture. Third is that ICS network visibility and monitoring. So that ability to have network appliances or data collection to be able to understand what's happening in that systems of systems world. What are the commands and protocols being passed back and forth? Understanding what's happening inside the ICS protocols, where the actual command data is, which is the whole point of those protocols. It's not the wrapper, it's the command data. So can I actually tell that somebody is turning a logic controller on and off? Can I tell that somebody uploaded new logic to a safety system? Can I tell that the switch key was moved from run to program mode? Like, can I tell what's going on in this environment? And the important thing about critical control 3 is, while we want to get into threat detection, the first use case of the ICS network visibility and monitoring critical control, that critical control 3, is the validation of that defensible architecture. We put this all in place. Is it actually what we expected? Is it maintaining? Is it maintaining over time? Now we're doing it through continuous monitoring. Did somebody throw up a rogue connection that we didn't know about and violated our defensible architecture? Did somebody modify all the firewall rules so that it's really just open, and any for everything? Like, what has changed in that environment? So incident response, critical control 2 is defensible architecture. The third critical control around network visibility monitoring is to reinforce that defensible architecture. That's the first use case. Then the second use case is to be able to do the detections to get us to the incident. It's no good having an incident response plan if you're not doing the threat detection, because you'll never see the incident. You'll never see the threats. So having that second use case of, cool, what are the threats that we care about? And in this case, we're not just doing like IOCs and things like that, or indicators of compromise. You're looking for the tactics, techniques, and the procedures of the adversaries and of the threat scenarios you care about. So instead of sending every single alert to the SOC that they have to triage and drown in alerts, and now we're doing orchestration tools and everything to try to have less, you said, cool, we can go hunting in all of that extra stuff. But tier 1 analyst, out of the 81 tactics, techniques, and procedures in MITRE ATT&CK for ICS, these 22 are the most relevant to us based on the scenarios we've all aligned on. So we want you to be sure that you're focusing on that, usually through prioritization or making sure that there is SLAs on triaging those type of alerts. The rest of the stuff, go be proactive when you have resources and time. So don't kill yourself over it. Okay. So that now again aligns even the security operations side of the house to make sure that we can actually be aligned with that first critical control, and we're not drowning in all the data, especially data we may not understand yet, especially if we have new staff coming in that don't understand the operations environment. The fourth critical control is secure remote access. People want to jump to secure remote access or two-factor authentication all the time, but they don't even know what their inventory is. And time again, we see companies that have the nice two-factor, authentication, secure remote access projects and have them fully rolled out, but miss the unauthenticated VPNs and things that were still resident in the environment and didn't do a lot of good. So you're doing this in order: ICS incident response, defensible architecture, network visibility and monitoring. The fourth is the secure remote access. Now that we actually know what's important to us, we actually know what our environment looks like, we actually have a better architecture. Now's the time to go put that in place. And then the last one is a key vulnerability or risk-based vulnerability management. Now, that does not mean you're going to go through and patch everything. In most cases, you don't need to in operations. Most cases, you can make a firewall change or disable a port or service, and it fixes the issue better than the vulnerability patching. Vulnerability patching in ICS is very inconsistent, and it's, some of the vendors are better than others in terms of what they actually put in those. So at Dragos, we have this year in review report we put out every year, and we highlight the vulnerabilities as an example. We talk about the cases and threats and incidents, but we talk about the vulnerabilities as well. And every year that we put out that report, the vulnerabilities section has been eye-opening in the sense that around, I think, 38% of the time consistently, there are errors in the vulnerability reports. So you're using erroneous data to go deal with it. About 70% of the time, there's no mitigation advice other than patch it or don't. And all these vulnerabilities, like over 1,000 a year, many of them are useless in the context of operations. So what we do is we go through and look at it and apply a simple filter: green, yellow, red, never, next, now. These vulnerabilities, these green ones, pose no risk. They're doing things that are already resident in the environment. Like, let's say I have a vulnerability that allows me to get the ability to upload logic to a controller from an engineering workstation in root permission. Well, that's already what happens on an engineering workstation. So that makes no sense to ever even use that vulnerability. The yellows are ones that are like, yeah, this introduces some new functionality, but it's not necessarily easy to exploit. It doesn't really have a huge operational impact, and we don't see anybody actually exploiting this anywhere. It's the next. So the greens are nevers. The next, the yellows are, yeah, get to this at some point. And then the reds are somebody's either actively exploiting this or it introduces net new functionality that has real operational impact. And we look every year at these vulnerabilities, like I said, about 1,000 new ones each year. What we find is consistently about 60% is in that never category. About 30 something percent is in the next category of the next opportunity. You should go take advantage of this. The now category consistently is about 2 to 4%. So I don't want to go into an operations site making a big heyday about vulnerabilities and what's our vulnerability patch ratios going up to the board or things like that. I want to be able to tell them, look, based on the strategy we're putting out and all the things that we're doing together, we're going to be able to identify these vulnerabilities on the inventory that you have. And we're going to keep like 96% of this crap off your plate. But when we come to you about the 2 to 4%, we're going to need your partnership because it's really that important. And now you've shown that you're not just coming in to do things in an operational environment just because you can, but you're taking a responsible approach and you're keeping a lot of the stuff off their plate because you're doing the hard work ahead of time. So ICS incident response, which is also really setting those scenarios and what do we actually care about, which is going to guide the strategy, down into control 2, which is defensible architecture, down into control 3, visibility and monitoring, down into control 4, secure remote access, down to control 5, key vulnerability management program, or essentially risk-based vulnerability management. That together sets a strategy and real controls that are based on real threats, and they're things you can easily communicate, and it also isn't gold plate in the problem. So you now have the ability to go roll this out instead of a Gantt chart over 5 years with 30 controls that you'll never get to. If you do this approach, you will be in a very good place. I would call this like this is the right approach for the threats and things that we're seeing out in the wild. Additionally, the things you're doing have operational impact and operational resilience impact beyond threats. As an example, the visibility and monitoring stuff. Root cause analysis is getting complex as automation environments become more and more automated and more digital. We have plenty of cases where operators are confused about what happened, even if it's not an adversary, and they don't know how to recover the plant correctly or safely because of this massive amount of sort of automation. Used to, if you went to the factory, the substation, the plant, whatever, somebody's, that engineer, her granddaddy worked at that plant, her daddy worked at that plant, she's worked at that plant for 30 years. Like, they know it. They've always known it. They've always known how to deal with their plant. But because of all the automation, because of all the digital transformation, whatever you want to call it, it takes now that person to know a subsystem who then calls an integrator who also has the OEM takes a team to even try to really figure out what the hell is going on. But as we're doing these security controls actually help with operational resilience use cases. Secure remote access. I don't just have random contractors and integrators coming in and violating SLAs and making changes in the environment, security related or not. The network and visibility monitoring piece. I can actually see the systems of systems and know what commands are sent and make sure that my automation environment is online correctly, reinforce it, find out that the battery pack failed on the PLC and that's why we're having intermittent issues, or somebody got in an overhead ceiling and knocked off a GPS clock and that's why we're having a time shift across the energy management system. It's just good operational resilience to have these type of controls and they have security benefit. Those are the ones that are going to be the easiest to get through in your organization, the ones that are easiest to get well-funded, and the ones that have pound for pound shown the best return on investment against adversaries. So I am winding down here. Got a couple minutes left. I don't have a ton of questions. I see some questions, but if you have questions, this is the time and place. Let's see. How can we verify or validate the proof of concept of network visibility and monitoring solutions in ICS? Yeah. So again, I think the first thing is having like the use cases identified of what are we trying to do? So this is our architecture as an example, or high level, because you may not have it yet if you're buying a tool to do inventorying. So here's my architecture. Here's my scenarios from the incident response. Okay, here's the use cases I'm going to need to support. And if I care about, this scenario against threats for, let's say, oil and gas, okay, I need to know that you can detect the behaviors associated with a Trisis-like attack, or the TTPs associated with that. We want to test that. Or because this is an oil and gas environment, here's my environment that I have and carbon crack or whatever else. Here's the architecture. Can you validate that the architecture that we have? Can you find issues? Can you find problems in it? Can you continually monitor it and tell us what the architecture is so we can reinforce it? Key vulnerability management. All these solutions have vulnerability management. Cool. Are you actually helping me find vulnerabilities and give the guidance? Or are you just telling me, well, it's got a CVSS of 9.3, you should take care of it? That doesn't help us. Can I get into that like never next now and actually prioritize what are the key vulnerabilities? Because those are the ones we want to focus on instead of, beating up everybody. So those are, I would define the use cases. I will tell you though, at this stage in the market and the companies you mentioned, like they're all good solutions. Obviously I'm biased because I work over Dragos, but like I'm not that biased because I'm a SANS instructor and I'll tell you firsthand, like they all have their flavors, but all the solutions are pretty mature. Usually beyond just the use cases these days, people are asking questions on, cool, are you going to stay in business? Show me your financials. Are you going to be a good partner for us? Can you go down that journey with us post install? Like what's the support and help that you're providing us after we buy the product? Like those are as important to look at as the technical use cases. Yep. All right, let's see. We've got some more questions coming in. Oh, cool. Yeah. Thanks for the compliments. What would you say the distribution of the relative impact of threat intelligence is in the implementation of the 5 controls? Great. So threat intelligence to me is about knowledge, right? It's not like indicators. Indicators are the exhaust fumes of the intelligence process. Intelligence is really about having a requirement and being able to answer that requirement. It's knowledge. And that explicitly comes into play. I mean, it can be useful anywhere, but it really comes into play in Critical Control 1, ICS Incident Response, and Critical Control 3 of the ICS Network Visibility and Monitoring. So I should be able to have the intel on what are the actual scenarios so I can do things like threat modeling for what I actually care about as an organization. That's essentially what is happening at Critical Control 1. And I need to keep up with the latest understanding of the threats. The third one on visibility and monitoring, I got to know the tactics and techniques of the adversaries. So that's intel there. And actually on 5 as well, because risk-based vulnerability management, I need to be able to say, you know what, these are the vulnerabilities that adversaries are actually exploiting because those are the ones we care about most. So that's, intel can be used in a lot of ways, but those 3 controls are probably the best place to be using intel on them. All right. So I'm getting told that I've got to start wrapping up. I'll take the last question. Would you place OT assessments under your Critical Control 1? Depends. It depends on what it is. If it's an assessment for like if it's like a tabletop exercise, that's under Critical Control 1. If it's like an assessment of the architecture and things like that, it'd be under Critical Control 2 of like understanding and reinforcing the architecture. If it's like a compromise assessment or a hunt, it's stuff that you'd be linking into Critical Control 3. Now, technically, assessments aren't a critical control, but you can use them to bolster those critical controls. Awesome. All right. Well, and the last thing I didn't mention is all those standards and frameworks, NIST, 60443, et cetera, they're all wonderful. This isn't to replace them. This is a strategy. And then you take this strategy and you map it to your standard and framework of here's the common language, here's the common lexicon. This is what we're going to do. Here is how we're doing it. Here's the language that's already been used in the community. This is what we're going to map to. So you're not replacing the standards. You're using this to drive the strategy and to understand what controls make sense for you and to pare it down to 5 critical controls. And then the actual implementation and things of that, go map what you've done into the standard to be able to communicate about it widely. So it's a way that it all actually really works together.
Thank you for listening to the Wait Just an Infosec podcast. Remember to join us live every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern for a new episode of Wait Just an Infosec. You can watch at sans.org/WJAI or go to the SANS LinkedIn or YouTube channels. The Wait Just an Infosec podcast will be released every Wednesday at noon. Thanks for listening. See you next week.